Let's talk about this monstrosity. Hello once again, and welcome to the Prince Magnum channel, where hot rodding and romance do coexist. I'm your host, Prince Magnum, and today we're going to dive back into do-it-yourself budget hot rodding, the mini-series known as Performance Not Included. If you've kept up with the channel, you know that the true star of the Prince Magnum channel is my wonderful project known as Project Spirit, a 1975 Ford Maverick four-door. With her original inline 250 3-speed manual transmission with a Hurst shifter mounted on top. All that being said, a lot of people turn their noses up at the performance of the 1970s because the numbers weren't as big as they were in the 1960s, and they weren't as big as modern day cars. All of that being said, this is kind of crass. It's a crass generalization. There was performance in the 1970s. You just had to do the work to get it out of that car. So, right now I am actually holding a Motorcraft carburetor for an inline 6 from like the 50s into the 60s, okay? Now right away, some of you might be sitting there going, gosh, that almost looks like it belongs on a tractor. Duh. For the record, I do know Ford actually made tractors at one point in time. That being said, inside, it's not much different. It pretty well even inside it looks like it belongs on a tractor. This was carburetor technology of the 1960s. This was the carburetor technology that made the muscle car era. Not very high tech, if you ask me. In most cases, it was as far as fuel efficiency goes, it was non-existent. So by 1970, the muscle car era was dead, not 1980, and they do not make muscle cars today. That being said, in 1970, that was pretty much it. The writing was on the wall, no more muscle cars. Car manufacturers tried to eke out a few for many years. I know for Ford, they were able to get away with it till like 1975. General Motors got away with it pretty much until like 1976. But that was the end of it. I mean, the writing was on the wall. I don't know enough about Mopar to really. I don't know enough when they basically, like when the 426 was gone and the 440 from the cars. I know like in Lincoln you could get like the 460 all the way up until like 76, but you get the general idea. Performance was really just non-existent as far as the numbers go in once you got into the 70s. If you were to twist my arm and ask for a specific year when there was really the last year for the what I'll call the last gaspers of the muscle car era, 1975 would be where you draw the line. After that, there is no more muscle cars. Again, we do not build modern muscle cars. We build modern tuners with muscle car DNA, but that's another subject for another time to talk about again. So in the 1970s, carburetors like that had to clean up their act. This is also the time that we started seeing very restrictive smog pumps come out onto vehicles, and that's another subject for a whole nother video in itself. So we started seeing carburetors internally start changing. If you were to open up Project Spirit's carburetor, you would see a lot of differences from that to this. You know, it's really apples to oranges, even though they're both carburetors. That being said, all of the manufacturers here in the United States was getting on board. This is an awesome thing because even if they, because before I go any further, let me also say that in the 1970s, quality control sucked, okay? All the engines leaked oil, and even though these carburetors were supposed to clean up their act, not all of them did. And then there was a human factor that also played in, but we'll get to that in a minute. If you got your hands on a carburetor from the 1970s, you knew that you had to get a good solid rebuild kit. And if you got a good rebuild kit and knew what you were doing, or knew somebody who really knew what they were doing, they could fine-tune that carburetor and get the maximum performance out of that thing. I know some of you were sitting there saying, really? That almost seems impossible. No, it wasn't impossible. There was actually a guy who mouthed off on my channel basically saying, well, I never got it, that kind of fuel efficiency out of a carburetor from the 70s. You did it wrong, okay? You did it wrong. And this is where the human factor comes in. People didn't know that this technology, because basically, if you got a really precise rebuild kit, you could get that thing to be fuel efficient. It wasn't just dumping fuel. And then you had to be careful when you put the screws back in, you're putting it back together, you didn't over torque it. Let me see if I can find a really good example of, because this thing's actually missing a bunch of stuff off of it. But okay, here would be an example where someone started kind of really screwing with this thing and they shouldn't have. Okay, you got that in the 70s too, and that's just because people, would over torque the screws, like going in here, and it would warp the body. Well, when that happens, it starts dumping fuel. Carburetors jump. This was also commonplace with your Rochester Quadrajets. That's why they have the horrible, people call them quadra junk, and it's just because people were stupid and didn't know how to put them back together right. If you knew what you were doing, those carburetors were very fuel efficient, and they would provide enough performance that you would be laying down serious hate on the drag strip. And if you would actually build your project around that, you had something amazing. Case in point, there was another YouTuber that put out a video, and I'll have to put it in editing, but he actually has a 74 four-door Maverick, well, a 74 two-door Maverick that he dailies, a Maverick Grabber, and loves the car. Has the 302 in it, and all he did was just kind of put it back together, and he put a 4-barrel carburetor on it with a high-rise intake, and this thing is amazing. Everybody knows that in the 1970s, if you got the fuel to air right and you got the spark right, basically if you knew what you were doing about the carburetor tech in the 1970s and you knew what was available to you, you could get out of a stock engine as much performance as you could in the 1960s. Now the numbers didn't match up, but basically the technology was there. You had to know what you were doing. So again, that just proves my point that we really nailed down carburetor tech in the 1970s. Of course, by the 1980s, we started messing with that. We started seeing the carburetor go away in place of fuel injection. And if anybody knows anything about fuel injection in the 1980s, fuel injection was absolutely horrid. The computers could not keep up with the engines, and you weren't getting the best bang for your buck. As far as fuel injection goes, it didn't really start coming into its own until like the mid-1990s. And of course, if you were to ask me the pinnacle of that technology, that would be from about 2001 to about 2012. After that, I'm just going to quote one of my favorite Star Trek movies of all time, Star Trek 3, the search for Spock. When the guy who plays as Scotty says, the more you complicate the plumbing, the easier it is to clog the drain. That's modern day fuel injection for you. So, if you like fuel injection, by all means, go right on ahead. But if you know your stuff about carburetor technology, you know that in the 1970s, that's when it really came into its own. That's when it got good. Did it stop there? Well, today, carburetor companies today, like Holley and so many others, Holley's the one I always go with, has done an amazing job to continue that technology. Performance is phenomenal from these carburetors, and if you know what you're doing with them, again, you can have a stock engine from the 1970s. You can put one of these modern day carburetors on them and fine tune it to a point where it is fuel efficient. It can put down serious performance. Just remember, in V8s, if it's stock, 600 CFM 4-barrel is all you need. If you're doing 650, you better have that on an actual race engine. If not, too much fuel, you're not getting the fuel efficiency. Too much carburetor, and that's your own fault. Okay, basically, you're defeating the purpose of making it a performance engine. You don't put a 650 on. Some people just don't know that. Okay, so basically, to recap, if Project Spirit had a 302 5.0 to you younger ones, from the 1970s, all I would have to do to get serious performance out of that engine would be to yank off the 2-barrel intake and the 2-barrel carburetor and basically get a high-rise 4-barrel carburetor intake, aluminum obviously, maybe from a company like Wyand or Edelbrock, whichever you prefer. I prefer Wyand. I like their stealth. Cheaper, wider range of performance. Beats Edelbrock hands down. And then slap on, say, like a modern day Holley 4-barrel 600 CFM with an electronic choke, and that would be all she would need. And I would be able to do everything that the cars of today does with very, very little hassle. Or with her inline 6, basically fine-tune that carburetor, which we have done, and make a few minor modifications around that entire setup, and basically she's ready. I mean, other than suspension-wise, she would be ready for dirt track, which that's another subject for another time, about how the inline 6s were suited for certain things. She would actually just about be ready for drift mode too. So there you go. That brings us to the usual spot. If you like this sort of stuff, you want to see more and more where we dive into the technology of the 70s, how there really was performance, please leave a positive comment in the box below. Again, any hate, do remember, everything that you see me doing, I'm doing on a budget, out of pocket, with a car from the 1970s, and I'm still laying down hate like modern cars that are pushing a lot more performance than I am. And I'm still doing it when I only have to fill up maybe at best once every other week. So you're only peeing on your own shoes. You look like a reject. Okay? Real quick before we get to the usual, montage that I give you at the end, I want to give a special shout out to obviously my buddy, the Cadillac Kid of Cadillac Kid Productions. I want to give a special shout out to a new friend that I've made here on YouTube, BST Ford channel. Absolutely fantastic guy. He also has a Project Maverick himself, a 1974 two-door Maverick. That also has an inline 250 automatic transmission. I can't wait to see what he does with it. I hope he keeps that for his channel. I'm just looking forward to the stuff that he's going to be doing. And as usual, the usual montage. Get out there and work on a project. Don't care what it is. Just do something with yourself. Something to be said about a do-it-yourselfer, I'm telling you. If you have a sweetheart, sweep them off their feet. Do something special for them. You might take them for a ride in your project car. And as always, for every last one of you out there, every one of you, if no one out there has told you that they love you today, if no one's told you that they love you today, Prince Magnum does. God bless you, and have a happy 24. Thank you. Gosh dang, that's an ugly son of a gun.